I'd like to commence by acknowledging people of the First Nations. We have participants from all over the world at this webinar. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging First Peoples from all countries and to pay my respects to them. We honour their wisdom and their stewardship of traditional lands and customs which enrich us all. Welcome to everyone. My name is Jenness Gardner. I'm the CEO of the Economic Regulation Authority in Western Australia and convener of the Western Australian chapter of the National Regulators Community of Practice. It's my privilege and pleasure to moderate today's seminar with our two distinguished speakers. They're going to share with us their hot off the press findings on why and how people around the world are complying with COVID-19 rules and behaviours. The idea is not only that we'll get to see the fascinating results of recent surveys, but also that there'll be some useful insights and ideas for every regulator about behaviour and compliance. First off, some housekeeping. For colleagues who would be interested but might have missed today, all of the National Regulator Community of Practice webinars are recorded and available on the NRCoP YouTube channel within 7 days. As usual, we'll be using the free app Slido for your questions and comments. If you go to slido.com and enter #comply, you can start asking questions immediately and vote for other people's. I'll be keeping an eye on that as we speak. Recognising that our audience are busy people, we'll be taking a short break at the 45-minute mark, but Benjamin and Liam have kindly agreed to stay on for a further 15 minutes to answer as many of your questions as possible in that time. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Benjamin van Rooij from the University of Amsterdam and Professor Liam Smith from BehaviourWorks Australia at Monash University. If I read out everything these two had accomplished, there'd be no time for the webinar, so for greater detail, I recommend you set aside a few hours and visit their websites. In short, Benjamin is now Professor of Law and Society at the University of Amsterdam, having previously been at the University of California's Irvine School of Law. In addition to editing the top-ranking journal Regulation and Governance, writing for a general audience and advising governments, he is the founder of ComplianceNet, an international academic compliance research network. Liam is the director of BehaviourWorks Australia and is based in Monash University's Sustainable Development Institute. Since establishing BWA in 2011, he has overseen significant growth, and the research group now has a portfolio of over 400 behaviour change projects in collaboration with government and industry partners. You can check out their website for numerous inspiring examples of bridging the research practice gap. Welcome to you both.
Welcome everybody to this webinar. It's my great pleasure and honour to be invited all the way for the webinar in Australia and New Zealand. I'll just get right to it. So since the crisis started in January in China, I've paid close attention to what was happening. And what I found interesting is the immense behavioral challenges in trying to mitigate the spread of the virus. So having studied compliance for over 20 years, I decided with my research group at the University of Amsterdam, as well as with colleagues at Arizona State University and Bar-Ilan University in Israel, to start a survey to understand what makes people comply with the rules. We focused on two types of rules. One is whether people stay at home for activities other than those where they're allowed to go out. Second, whether they keep a safe distance from others. So we did the survey in the US first. We did a survey in April 3 with 570 participants from 35 states. We selected the states based on whether they already had a lockdown in place on April 1st. We used the surveys. That means we asked people to indicate how frequently they engaged in certain behaviors that were no longer allowed under the measures in place. So for instance, I always keep indicate how frequently you do the following, for instance, keeping a safe distance from others, and that would be according to the rules in place, or not go outside only for activities that are non-essential, also according to the rules. So then we asked them a long list of questions that we developed based on our insights from psychology, criminology, some behavioral economics, trying to understand what could be possible influences on their compliance. And when we did a statistical analysis of which of these factors had an influence, we found the following list, as you can see here on the slide, that played a role in the US. So we saw on the one hand that the more they thought it was morally obligatory to comply with these measures, the more they would do so. The more they had negative emotions because of the crisis, the more they would comply. The more they were impulsive, so the less impulse control they had, the less they would comply. The more they saw other people comply, the more they would comply as well. The more they were able to comply, for instance, work from their homes, or keep a safe distance from others in their regular lives, the more they would do so. The less opportunity they had to comply, the more they would comply, or the more opportunity they had, the less they would comply. So that means if they were still able to get close to other people, they would comply less with the rules. If they could still go to work, even though that wasn't allowed, they would comply less with the rules. And finally, we found that the more they saw they had an obligation to obey the law out of sort of a fear, so not out of something intrinsic, the less they would comply. I'll get to that in a little bit. I'll first want to give an overview of the results. Second, we then did a survey also in the Netherlands and the UK. In the Netherlands, we did one between April 7 and 14 with 568 participants. Like the US, we saw that self-reported compliance was high. The mean was 6 out of 7, 7 being I'm always in compliance all the time. So it was very close to that. Here we saw similar factors, but some different things. What was different was that fear for their health, not only their own health, but also health of friends and family, as well as health in general, played a role. So the more they had this fear, the more they were in compliance. Similar to the US, moral alignment. So whether they thought they had a moral duty to obey these particular rules played a role. Impulsivity, the same, more impulsive, less compliance. We also measured the knowledge of the measures here, and which we didn't measure in the US. And we saw that the better they understood the measures, the more they complied, which makes sense. And again, we see that capacity and opportunity played the same roles as in the US. In the UK, sorry, we had to split up the measures because the different questions we asked didn't load into one construct. So I report here the findings separately for whether they were still meeting people outside of their own household, whether they were keeping a safe distance from others, and whether they complied with lockdown measures, whether they stayed at home when they should have. Again, you see very high levels of compliance early April. We see fear of disease playing the opposite role as in the Netherlands, which is hard to understand at first glance, which is one of these problems when doing surveys like this. So the more they feared disease, the less they complied. This may be understandable when we look at the third variable here, which is negative emotions. People who had more negative emotions complied less with the lockdown. Maybe what played here was that people who feared the disease also were very uncomfortable, didn't feel right, and left their houses as a result. But we don't know that for sure. We have to look deeper into that. We see the same thing as we saw in the US and the Netherlands, for specific moral alignment. So if you feel that you really have a duty to obey these particular rules, you do so. Same as the Netherlands, we see knowledge of the rules played a positive role in the lockdown. And again, we see the capacity to comply playing a role with meeting people and safe distance compliance. And we see the normative obligation to obey the law, which is different from the non-normative. This is sort of an intrinsic obligation to obey the rules, which means you obey the rules because you generally think you have a duty to obey the law in general, which we saw played a large role in the UK, which it didn't in the Netherlands and the US. And finally, this was the only place where early April we saw that political orientation played some role. We saw that more conservative oriented people in the UK were less likely to comply with safe distance rules. when I get to my overall findings, if we sort of take a helicopter view of this, first big thing is that fear of punishment didn't really play a role, a significant role in any of these cases. This doesn't mean that regulators could just let go of punishment. That would be a counterfactual. If there were zero chance of getting caught in violating the rules or zero punishment, probably we would get very different results. But in the current framework, with the punishment that we have, with the detection capacity that we have, we don't see that it has influenced people in their decision. What did matter were two things. One is people's intrinsic motivations, which are different types of things. So we see this morality they have, that they should obey these rules, or the general morality that they should generally obey the law. We also see social norms, whether they think others are obeying the rules. And we also see, to a certain extent, but with mixed effects, fear of health. The other big thing is practical abilities and opportunities. The more people were able to follow the rules, the more they would comply, and the more people had the opportunity to break the rules, the more they would do so. So this really shows two different approaches. We speculate in the papers and what that will mean for the period that we're going into right now. We see now in the countries that we're studying that lockdowns are easing, and that means that we think it will get harder. First of all, with easing lockdowns, once businesses open up, once public venues open up, once beaches open up, there's going to be more opportunities to get close to other people, and you're actually asking people to make these behavioral decisions themselves. In the early lockdown that we studied in these surveys, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to actually go out and meet people. It was just very locked down. There wasn't bars to hang out. It was harder to mingle, to go to theaters, etc. The more we open up, the more we're asking of society, of the businesses themselves, but also people individually, to ensure that they will take the right decisions to keep a safe distance. So that's harder. Second thing we expect is that intrinsic motivations will lower. Most likely, as we get past the first wave, there's less fear of health, so what effect we saw there. And also with the costs of compliance rising, which didn't play a role, we did test for that early on, likely at some point they will start to play a role. And finally, when there's more people going out and about, it's going to be more hard to enforce the rules. So we don't really believe that a focus on stronger enforcement in of itself will be sufficient to deal with these new challenges. What are the general implications for regulators? What can we learn from this particular moment in time, early April lockdown? I think two things. One is, this has been, in my eyes, the biggest worldwide behavioral change directed by governments that led to a rapid behavioral change at tremendous cost with very limited enforcement. So we do see it's possible to do this. We also see that it was possible largely because opportunities for violating rules were reduced through the policies, as well as that people had strong intrinsic motivations, which I think are quite unique to the case. I think it generally shows that regulating behavior means looking beyond enforcement only. And I say beyond, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be enforcing, but looking beyond enforcement only and looking at broader mechanisms that include these practical capacities and opportunities, as well as the intrinsic motivations people have. And this is very much in line with a lot of other research that has looked at behavioral change and regulatory effectiveness in other cases. I wanted to leave it at that for now today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Benjamin. That was really interesting to look at some of the different findings from across the world. I guess my job is to provide a bit of an Australian context to this. We actually have asked some quite similar questions. It's interesting to start with the idea that Benjamin comes from a regulatory perspective. I'm a psychologist by background, and so I was just reflecting on some of the terms that Benjamin was using. While some do come out of psychology, others certainly come from the regulatory and compliance literature. And looking at the more significant ones, we see alignment to this model of behaviour. This is one model of behaviour. There are many. It's as good or as bad as any others. It's called integrated model of behaviour. It combines a few different models, but we see that typically in compliance, that the idea of punishment or the consequences of a behaviour are typically measured in our world as behavioural beliefs. So they're measures about the outcomes or the perceived outcomes that are likely if I do the behaviour. And the sum of those add up to what we call the instrumental attitude. And so this idea of perceived threat very much sits as a measure of behavioural beliefs. We talked about norm, and I guess there was this thing in the presentation Benjamin just gave around specific moral judgment alignment, and doesn't sit exactly in this model, although some argue that injunctive norm is also a personal norm. So injunctive norm is the pressure that we feel from others to do particular behaviours, but one of those others can be ourselves actually, and so we have our own personal moral code that can be quite influential, and there's a lot of debates in the literature around how that fits. Non-normative obligation to obey the law very much sits as injunctive norm. Capacity to comply is what we would call perceived control. Opportunity to violate for not the desirable behaviour, but another behaviour would be what we call self-efficacy. And impulsivity would largely align to what the big five personality trait of conscientiousness, which is typically seen as a sort of an antecedent factor to most models of behaviour. In summary, there's some language differences here, but actually we're measuring a lot of the same things. So I want to talk to a little bit today about a survey we did called a survey about corona responses to understand behaviour, or the Scrub. It started, I guess, the initial idea of doing such a survey probably started at a similar time to Benjamin, and where we were seeing some decisions being made that could have been better informed. And this is a quote from our Prime Minister in March around hoarding behaviour, which we saw a lot of early in the piece. And basically he's berating the public for doing the wrong thing. Now, for a whole raft of reasons, this isn't a good idea. And a colleague and I wrote a piece in The Conversation that was shared pretty widely, and we're interviewed around it a lot to talk about why communication in that sense isn't probably such a good idea. So what struck us essentially was the need to be able to design, to provide evidence and advice that was able to inform how people, particularly in power, were communicating what was desired of the public. Now, despite what we saw and some of the early, I think, probably mistakes, it's a fair comment that Australia's management of corona is pretty good. We have arguably one of the best outcomes or best curves, growth curves, infection rate curves in the world, and that was mostly, I think, because of the actions of the government. They acted early and they acted strongly, and that probably has resulted in us being in, like I say, a fairly enviable position. But also I'd argue that it's a result of a high degree of compliance. So not only did the government ask early and enforce fairly early, but we had a fairly and relatively good compliance or level of compliance in Australians. So I think there's a combination of things that have led to Australia doing very well. I think it's important to know that we're actually moving into a space now where the behaviours that we want to encourage are probably a little bit more difficult to regulate. We want people to check on their neighbours. We don't want people we want people to keep distances from each other if they're out in public. And these are things that are much harder to regulate. So I think there's a need to use a broader suite of tools than the more regulatory or legislative or punitive tools that have been used to date. So Scrub survey is really designed to look at probably a little bit different to Benjamin's in that it's probably a bit broader in terms of it's capturing a lot more behaviour, but a little bit shallower, although we do diagnose some particular behaviours in depth. So there's three ways. We ran one in March, one in April, one in May. The data for the third one has just come in within the last 3 or 4 days. The survey in March really focused on 5 core health behaviours, and we tried to diagnose in a fairly general way as to why people were doing those core health behaviours. So these are things like staying at home, keeping your distance, covering coughs and sneezes, washing your hands, not touching your face. So we had a depth look at those, but we also measured 15 other behaviours around excess buying or cancelling, avoiding meetings and the like. In wave 2, and then there was a raft of other measures that were interested in what people were worried about, where people sought information, who was trusted sources, etc. In wave 2, we really shifted to do much more significant diagnoses, much more in-depth diagnosis of the 5 core behaviours, and that's some of the data I'll present to you in a minute. We reduced the number of other behaviours we measured, but again measured a whole raft of other things that we also measured in wave 1. Wave 2 probably was the biggest turn we've taken, which was really focusing on particular behaviours around transport and transport intentions. So as we open up, we're really concerned that people will all get in their cars and congestion will be a problem, or even if they do use public transport, that will be a problem in itself as well. So we're actually seeking to flatten the public transport curve as well. So just trying to understand that. But we did again diagnose the 3 core behaviours. Well, we diagnosed 3 core behaviours, the 2 that Benjamin mentioned around staying at home and keeping a social distance, and then we measured just 1 hygiene behaviour, and then a whole raft of others again. So I'll present some of the findings from these different waves, but I'll focus particularly on these two waves. So most of you will know who are part of a compliance network or any regulatory network will know that often knowledge of the rules is one area where people typically plead innocence, I guess, for want of a better word. And clearly that's not the case here. So we asked people if they, this is self-rated, but their knowledge of the rules and regulations in their state. And we see here that about 95% of Australians rated a midpoint from very poor to very good knowledge or higher. So clearly a lot of people know the rules or say that they know the rules in their area. Again, with adherence to rules, we see the same sort of pattern, a very high level of compliance rate, and that's reflected in the data we see. We did measure perceived norm, which is the idea of understanding how many other people are doing and following the rules and regulations. And here we see that there's this general consensus that most people are doing the desirable behaviours. And we'll know from norms, and I think Benjamin pointed this out again, that they're very much self-perpetuating. So the more we perceive what the people are doing, the more likely we are to follow, which then leads to the perception that more people are doing, the more that we're doing, that when we're likely to follow. So there's this kind of spiral around perception and reality that that continue to keep people doing the things we want them to do in this case. So more specifically to the 2 key behaviours that we're interested in, so staying home and keeping social distance, I think one of the really interesting findings is being able to track people over 3 points in time. So we are able to survey the same people in March, April and May. Each wave introduced new participants, but generally speaking, we're able to capture more than half of the respondents from the last survey. And we see this waning. It's good. It's interesting to know the 3rd wave we put out into the field just before restrictions were released. In fact, almost as they were being relaxed. But we asked behaviour in the last 7 days. And while I'm only highlighting these 2 behaviours, this sort of up and down pattern between March, April and May is replicated for almost all the behaviours that we looked at. So what that kind of hints to us and suggests is that people were pretty much starting to not adhere to the rules already and starting to wane in their commitment to doing them. So maybe that was in anticipation because the announcements about restrictions were made ahead of the survey, ahead of their implementation. So people may have already been thinking about, well, how can this, maybe it's okay to start behaving in particular ways now. We asked people this question, which is around what stops you from staying at home, and we've got the same data for what stops you from keeping social distance. Here, and these are probably the negative framing of these make it a little bit more difficult to understand the results, but largely we see, again, norms playing a key role. So perhaps if we rephrase this, what enables me from staying at home is a lot of people perceive that other people are doing it, which helps enable them to stay at home. So norms, again, we see playing a key role, as well as the resources. So resources I'll touch on again. We did some regression analysis in a couple of slides, but nonetheless, resources was another key barrier. Same question, but for about keeping distances. Again, we see norms But we do see this group of 18% of people saying, actually, I don't want to do that behaviour. And most of you know from regulatory theory that's the group that you probably need to pay a bit of attention to when you think about compliance. So we like Benjamin ran some regression analyses. There are many analyses we've run, but these are some snapshots. This looks at some drivers of staying home in the last 7 days, and we see two here that were significant. So the first is around being able to meet education and work responsibilities. What this says, where people had the resources and the ability to work from home, or to be at home and achieve the education and work outcomes that they needed, they were much more likely to be able to stay home. And that makes logical sense. It was the strongest predictor. But also being able to meet daily needs of like shopping, etc., can really be influential. We also ran the same model around keeping distance, and again we ran regression. We see some slightly different outcomes here. So consequences to my own infection, my chance of risk, again, was the most significant predictor. The new habits and routines that I've formed were a strong predictor as well as the consequences of me spreading it to the community and my own personal responsibility, again, aligning to the concepts that Benjamin pointed out. One of the interesting things in this graph, though, is that we don't see other people doing it as a significant predictor of behaviour. So the perception that others are doing it. Now, it's a really interesting one with norms, and there's lots of research around our perception of what others are doing and how it influences us. We know it does influence us, and that's been proven repeatedly in different contexts in almost every culture. However, what's also true is that we're not always conscious or even willing to admit the influence that others' behaviour has on us, so our perception of norms. So it can be difficult to capture that. It's often more unconscious, or even if it is conscious, we don't like to admit it. So we also ran a regression that put some more variables in there. So these are a graph. This table just outlines the things that are predictive and positively predict, and then some that actually don't predict in Australian data, staying at home. So your age or gender or where you live, or fear of losing a loved one, for etc. They are not significant predictors of behaviour. Some of the ones I've talked about are here on the left, but we added a few more variables in there in that model that shows, for example, having a chronic condition or not having children was more predictive of being able to stay at home. So I guess to summarise, it's interesting that Australian data, there are some certainly analogies and a lot to some of the international data that Benjamin presented. Australia is a generally compliant country. I think we sometimes like to think of us as free spirits and embrace that kind of culture, but actually, in general terms, I think Australia has been very compliant, and we continue to be relatively compliant. But this is waning, and that seems to be consistent across the whole raft of behaviours we measured in the scrub. Norms aren't really a predictor of behaviour, but they are positive, and we know that they can be used. So in other words, we are seeing a lot of people doing desirable behaviour, and then we can emphasise that point to get that self-perpetuating relationship between actual behaviour and perception of what others are doing. We need interventions that enable the people to get what they need and facilitate working from home, obviously a key activity to encourage that behaviour. And particularly emphasise the consequences for themselves and others if people don't adhere to these. So messages along those lines. And indeed, we did test some of these messages in some other in one of the ways of the study to see what was efficacious. I did include a link here because I thought it might be useful for some of the participants. It's interactive where you can go and access the data yourself. You can play with different data sets, or so you can ask for different outcomes or variables. You can screen it by wave or by gender or by age and click on different options. The Australian data is very well populated, although there is a whole raft of other countries that are starting to input data into that interface as well. So I'm encouraged you to get online and use that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Benjamin and Liam. Some really fantastic insights from the current crisis here. Obviously, the sorts of questions that we're starting to get through, some of them are focusing on the current crisis, and some of them are about what does this mean for regulation going forward. So I might start with the one that's got the most support at the moment, which is a question for Benjamin, but I think it's got, I think I'd be interested, Liam, in some of the thoughts that you might have on this one too, which is looking at the results of some of the work, looking at results in particular of Benjamin's study. It appears that these aren't good results for rule makers and fans of tough rules and tough policing, and wondering whether or not compliance needs to be rethought. Could I get you to comment on each of that, please?
So first of all, I saw that question and I thought, yes, it's not good news for people who care about tough enforcement. But I wouldn't say it's bad news for rule makers. Rule makers can make all kinds of rules. So I think it's an important thing to note that this is not outside of anything that we didn't know before. So there's a large body of work both about criminal justice as well as about regulatory enforcement that shows that stronger punishment in of itself cannot be proven to have an effect, a deterrent effect to reduce rule breaking. So we see this in studies about capital punishment in the US. We see this about the sentence enhancements, 3 strikes you're out type punishments in the US, again, criminal justice. We see this in a recent review about corporate deterrence, so strong punishment either against corporations as a whole or against individuals. We see that stronger fines in of themselves or longer prison sentences it can't be proven to deter. What do we know? We know several things. First of all, we know that the certainty of punishment is more important than the severity. So that means you have to focus much more on detection rather than on higher fines. And ironically enough, if you have higher fines, there is a chance that you get more evasion. Second thing we know also from the literature is that the perceptions of deterrence are not the same as the objective punishment. So a lot of people don't know exactly how high the chances of getting caught and punished are, or how high the fines are. This is not just for lay people, it's also, for instance, for compliance managers. So studies, for instance, in the chemical industry in the US have shown that compliance managers, they don't know signal cases, they don't know exactly how the law gets enforced. So the meaning of that is that enforcement is much more about communication rather than just about the punishment itself. One final thought on this. In my reading of the various literatures from criminology, economics, psychology, sociology, I found that there's 18 possible behavioral effects of punishment. So if you punish as a regulator, there's 18 different types of mechanisms that you could activate. They don't always get activated in each case. 8 of these are positive, meaning that if you punish more or stronger, you get more compliance. 10 are negative, meaning that if you punish more or stronger, you get less compliance. And I think what really matters is not just having a debate about whether we should punish or not, but rather a debate about what do we expect punishment to achieve, and what are the ways in which we can see it beforehand coming to achieve. So how does it interact with all these other motivations people have, or these other reasons that there are that people comply or not comply? So I think it's just a reframing of the debate on punishment. It's much more on how we punish and what we can expect it to achieve. And I think the findings of COVID really show that once again.
Thank you very much for that, Benjamin. That looks like some excellent thought starters for you, Liam. I'll hand over to you and ask you to comment as well, please.
Yeah, look, I tend to agree. Again, I'd point to the first slide I put up. I think we use different language, but because his comprehensive model of behaviour, which could be used for compliance behaviour as much as anything else, would have 100 or plus predictors on it. And so behaviour is complex. It's driven by macro, meso, and micro level factors. And understanding those is really important. I guess to the question around compliance, rule makers, I think the debate has, and I don't know this literature, I'm sure, as well as Benjamin, but we very much shifted from, why do we have compliance and why do we need indeed rules? Well, actually, the answer, I think, is behaviour change. So we do that for behaviour change, and so the fact that it may not be rule makers may not be achieving the right ends. It may be that they're not using the right tools. And if we looked at a broader model that included Benjamin's 18 drivers or any other model of behaviour that could unpack why people are doing the things they do, and then match intervention strategies to those drivers, which is a core discipline, I guess, that we participate in on every day as behavioural scientists, I guess you're in a much better place. So, I guess that adds a bit more from a behavioural psych point of view in terms of understanding in response to the question.
Can I say one more thing about that? So I think there's a context beyond this. So I've been in rooms with criminologists where they all say, we all know deterrence doesn't exist. And I raised my hand and I said, but do you realize the world out there doesn't know that? And even if you tell them, they wouldn't accept it. So I think for regulators out there, if they know this literature, if they know that the usage of punishment is complex, they're still in a political context where they're forced and pressured to go towards being tough on certain violations. I think the interesting thing there is to kind of see, why do we have this punitive intuition? Why do we have this punishment reflex, as I call it? So I've looked in different cultures and I can find ideas that punishment change behavior going back 500 BC across the globe. Also, it's hardwired in our brains. There's neuroscience showing that we get more dopamine, so we feel better, if we punish others. So part of the science goes against our tradition and against our kind of neurological wiring. So it's very hard to convince people even of the studies of things we don't know for sure are working. So it's very hard for regulators to just say, oh, we now read this stuff and now we're going to do it in a different way. So I very much realize how hard it is to use scientific insights in a context where there's a lot of political pressure and gut feelings going into it that show that, no, of course punishment works. Well, if you tell them and you show the data that it doesn't work, they still won't believe you. So it's not an easy thing to change.
I guess a question for you, Benjamin. I'm interested in your thoughts around how much of that is driven by the context in which regulators operate. So many have an act or a law or a legislative obligation, and then that very much guides how they approach it. And so the question really is, do you agree with that's true? And then secondly, how do we address something like that?
So I have a whole project that I started with European funding where we're studying the behavioral intuitions of regulators. So we're interviewing prosecutors who also have regulatory roles, environmental, tax and securities regulators, as well as compliance managers. And what we're really interested in is exactly this question. How do they think they can change behavior? And what shapes their thinking? And to what extent is their thinking aligned or not aligned with what we know in science? Of course, the legal context, the institutional context matter. There's the hammer and nail sort of mentality. I think especially prosecutors, what they do is prosecute. They can't really get to all the other behavioral mechanisms. But I think there is also the more individual human traits or human aspects. How as a human, your intuitions about behavior play a role. And finally, there is what I just mentioned earlier, there's the political context. There is a political oversight, there's the media framing, there's discussion. As soon as things go wrong, we get an immediately reflex towards tougher punishment and more rules. We all know this. And everybody's also anticipating on that. So I think that's also why I'm doing a lot of popular writing nowadays, to start this debate more in the popular realm and to show some of these revolutionary insights, how they actually link up to news events. That's also why the COVID research is so important. We can use this massive event, it suddenly gets everybody thinking about behavior. We can use it also to have a discussion about, okay, what actually does work for behavior and doesn't, to try and then get more support for a more sophisticated approach to other areas where we want to do behavioral change.
So would you, sorry, I'm going to go off the field here and just ask, what I think you're arguing, Benjamin, is that what's the most interesting aspect of this, in effect, global experiment and enforcement that's going on is you're almost able to control for cultural effects, for different types of rules that have been put into place. What you're actually seeing is how enforcement plays out overall across the globe in real time. Is that what you're finding?
Well, that's a very hard one. So first of all, we find doing comparative research in this is very hard. Second, as you've seen with Liam's presentation, it's a moving target. So we also now have done a second and third wave in the Netherlands. We've done a second wave in the US. Rules are changing. Methods of enforcement are changing. Moral appeals messages are changing. So if you do that in one country, it's already hard. If you do it in multiple, it's really hard. I don't really personally believe, having more of an anthropology background, that you can easily measure a culture. I don't like that. I find it kind of essentializes something that's very complex. So I also saw a question in the feed about culture. What I do think is interesting is that we find similar sort of patterns in very different countries with very different systems. And I think that's an interesting thing, but it's going to take us months, I think, once we're further into this, to chew on this and to really get more into a comparative analysis, which at this moment I just don't feel comfortable saying much about because it's so complex.
I guess I'd add that it is fair to say that there's a global experiment going on here. Whether we can analyse the data in the way that you're suggesting, Jenness, I'm not so sure as well. But there are clearly lots of rules being made in different countries, but there are also lots of other attempts to persuade people to do the right thing or to do desirable behaviours. And take one, for example, that we've looked at extensively around, not touching your face and understanding, how we might persuade someone to not touch their face. And I don't know about you, but I participate in many Zoom or Microsoft Teams meetings. And if you just spend 10 or 15 minutes watching the participants, almost everyone will touch their face and most will do it completely unconsciously. And so it's really hard to think about, well, how do we change those behaviours and how do we influence those? So there are some more regulated and compliance-based behaviours, and there are some, you could argue, that we're constantly testing and learning about what works and what doesn't. And indeed, as we change the bar to relax restrictions, we'll see what works as well. We did see some waning, as I pointed out, already happening, and maybe that was the signal about the restrictions being relaxed. I don't know, but we did see some waning. But equally, there are a whole raft of other behaviours that regulators may want to be of interest. They may not necessarily be squarely inside a legislative or regulatory act that involves, you have to do this to comply, but they are nonetheless desirable behaviours. For example, reporting others or the like that we are studying and learning about. And there are a lot of opportunities to gather data during COVID to be able to answer some of these questions that, to be frank, we haven't had a context that's allowed that probably ever. And so it was interesting. I sit on a few panels and I look at different researchers asking the question. That sometimes I think, wow, there's so many people asking so many questions around COVID at the moment, to the point where it's almost saturation. But actually, we're in a time where right now where we have to do this, because I'm sure we'll be looking at 2020, 2021 for decades to come, through a behavioural lens about what we learned and what worked and what didn't work and how to influence behaviour. So I think it's a very long way of answering your question, but I do think that there are lots of experiments going on. I do think we can learn a lot from them.
Thanks very much for that, Liam. Thanks very much for that, Benjamin. Does this highlight the importance of the communications function within regulators? So this is a practitioner's take on things, I think. And is this aspect under-resourced? And if I could change our order and start with Liam, please.
I think my answer will be quite brief, because I think Benjamin gave a pretty good response to this before. I think clearly communicating the rules, people having an understanding of what they are, is a necessary and fundamental premise. We've seen in other models around compliance that it's often the case that people don't know the rules or claim to not know the rules as a justification for non-compliance. And so I guess that's kind of step one. And typically our work with regulators has shown that yes, these functions are largely under-resourced. We don't see huge communication teams, and when we do, we don't see communication teams that are embedded into the role of the regulator. Their role comes in afterwards, which is to communicate the new rules or to tell people about what they need to do. whereas, if they were more embedded in the process of regulation, they may be able to indeed even avert the need for rules if they were able to communicate about, potential outcomes, how it affects people, or motivate behaviour through other means. So I think Benjamin sort of half answered that, I think, before. He may have addition to that, but that I think is very much the case, I would argue, at least with the regulators we've worked with in Australia.
So I think communication is key. It's key on several things. I already highlighted how it's key for enforcement. So enforcement is about leverage. You want to you want to scare away the monkeys by killing the chicken, as they say in Chinese. So you want to go from a small case and have a big effect on others. That means communication. That's the enforcement part. Liam touches upon another really important thing, which is legal knowledge. I just did a literature review for the forthcoming handbook on compliance that we're publishing with Cambridge University Press, and I was shocked how consistent the findings are. Empirical research shows people don't know the law. That's not an excuse or a justification. It is also a fact that if people don't know the law, how can you expect them to then comply with it? So a major, I think, misconception, especially in my field in law, is that if you make a law, people know it or should know it. And of course they should, it's not an excuse, but if they don't know the exact rules, then it's very hard to do the behavioral change as you think you do. So I think communication is key there. Of course, there are many people who comply with rules that they don't know when these rules are embedded in their own norms and their own personal morals. The third reason to do communication has to do with all the other mechanisms, and the majority of mechanisms are not enforcement or legal knowledge or just cost-benefit type thinking. If you want to use moral appeals, if you want to use social norms, so injunctive social norms, descriptive social norms, any of that, you want to understand how you communicate, and you want to get the knowledge about that. The nitty-gritty of that is very complex. So recently I've started to team up with communication scientists to really understand how do we get from understanding what the right message is to actually getting the right message out there. And I see there is not just in practice, but also in academia, a dire need for regulatory scholars and psychologists to team up more with the communication scientists who are really good at this.
Thank you very much for that. Look, I think sort of following on a little bit from what I think you were just saying there, I'm going to go to a question that's not the top of the list, but I think it would fit neatly with where you were just discussing. Was there a relationship between rule complexity and compliance? And I think further down, we've had a question as well about if we make the rules more complicated or the messages more complicated from staying at home or wash your hands, is it inevitable that compliance will drop? I think for me, those seem to be sort of some related kind of questions. I'll ask Benjamin to pick up first and then go back to you, Liam.
So when we did, the findings I've discussed so far, early April, we didn't find that. We did measure for complexity. By the way, I didn't mention this, we measured for a whole long list of other things that were all not relevant. So trust in science, trust in media, and all kinds of other things. So complexity of rules was not a significant predictor of compliance. I do think probably that might have changed by now. So even though the rules have been eased, what it really means, there's so much debate in the Netherlands, for instance, about this, what is and isn't allowed, which is very different from earlier. So I wouldn't be surprised if this changes in our data.
It's a difficult one for me to answer. I guess I'm not as embedded in the regulatory theory and literature as others, but I would argue that the rules as communicated in Australia have been pretty good. I think we have been fairly clear about the need to social distance. It's been ubiquitous. It's been delivered by trusted sources, and as we saw in some of the data I presented, people know the rules and comply with them. So I think generally speaking around COVID, we've seen a really I don't know that the question is that relevant. Around other behaviours, I guess I defer a little to regulatory scholars in that space in terms of, does complexity add difficulty? And I'm thinking of a particular case here in Australia where we've got an environmental regulator that's shifting to a general duty. I think that kind of case really poses some significant challenges, because while a general duty ostensibly is very simple, everyone is kind of responsible for the outcome, how that manifests in individuals and in small businesses and across a community is really complex. And for me, I see this actually playing out quite significantly in terms of the complexity of what that means for across the raft of different organisations that are now responsible for preventing environmental damage. So I'm not, maybe regulatory scholars could add a little bit more to that, but that's certainly the initial findings we're seeing with a general duty.
Just to add a little bit from the Dutch case, why I said it's complex. So the rules seem simple. It's keep 1.5 meters distance from others. What's happened though is that as we're opening up the society, people are redefining what they see as others. For instance, your household, it used to be this small group you live with. At some point, a lot of people are like, well, my neighbors are sort of my household. So I think people reinterpret, because it takes so much longer. I mean, we're 9-10 weeks in. At some point, they want to reinterpret the rules in a different way. And we see the same, for instance, about new rules in bars. So we're allowed to go in bars from June 7th. We're allowed to be close to people from our household. Okay, how do regulators check whether people are from the same household? Are they going to ask for ID and addresses, that everybody has that? So I think once you get more behavior out there and people start to mingle, that simple 1.5 meter rule suddenly has a lot of different behavioral interpretations. And there's a lot of different situations from which you get different practice interpretations, and then the rule shifts. And I think that's the sort of complexity I was talking about. It starts simple. It's similar to that sort of general environmental rule that Liam talked about. It seems simple, but once you get to the nitty-gritty, it's very complex.
Yeah, I would suggest that the Australian government is doing a reasonably job on this. Look, I would agree that it does introduce some complexity, but I guess what they've tried to emphasise is looking at raw numbers. So it's essentially said this many people in this type of space. And I don't think that solves it completely, but it certainly helps, so that you can say, I'm in a room and I'm with this many people, then that's I am in breach or I'm not in breach. And I think that the focus on numbers and spaces is actually helpful.
I'm going to turn now to a question that keeps being voted on here. Is there any empirical evidence that behaviour of political leaders, and they've nominated Trump and Dominic Cummings, directly affects compliance? I'll hand over to you, Benjamin, please.
Yes, so there was a survey done by colleagues of mine, one from UC Irvine, that was done between March 20 and 23 in the US. National representative sample, and it found conservatives were less likely to comply. So it asked inclination to comply, because there wasn't that much data yet, because people hadn't been in lockdown. Then when we did the survey, we didn't find political orientation played a role early April. So maybe what happened then, there was first of all, Trump in the US clearly went behind the rules early April. He wasn't asking state governments to ease lockdowns yet. And people were rallying behind the flag, I mean, so to say. I think that was a height of the crisis. I would expect now to see a much larger effect. So I do think political leaders matter. There was just one interesting piece of news here from the Netherlands that you may have missed. It was reported in The Guardian this morning. Our Prime Minister's mom just passed away, and she was very seriously ill the last month. And he complied with the rules. He didn't visit his mom on her deathbed. So that's sort of the opposite of the Cummings story, where he didn't have good reasons and he just went everywhere. Our leader, so it's interesting to see whether having that news will be effective. I don't think we have the measurement tools to really get to that. I think it probably would really need a different design, where you really get much deeper to models. But I think if I look where the effects would be, it influences social norms, both descriptive and injunctive. And also, and here's the thing we haven't discussed yet, the legitimacy of the rules in general and in particular, which social psychologists have for years shown to be a major influence of compliance. So if you want people to obey rules they don't really like, you want these rules to be very legitimate from a procedural point of view. So you want them to be consistent, you want them to be fair and honest. And I think leaders themselves play a very important role in that. If leaders are not complying with their own rules, how can they ask you to do so? So I think it is a very important thing. And I'd be interested to look at UK data before and after the news of Cummings.
Now, I'm mindful that we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask Liam if he wants to comment on that question and or anything else in terms of wrap up. And then I'll do the same with Benjamin and then close.
Yeah, so I guess on trusted sources, we did look at that, and indeed we had a similar situation with a leader in the local state of Victoria in Australia, where we saw our leader say, "I'm not visiting my mum because she's ill, and I'm not going to do that. So I'll just have to sit tight for a bit." I think it's a bit of it's an interesting one with leaders. I think they have to comply, and I think the more obvious their compliance and shared their compliance is, I think that the better. It doesn't take much to slip up, though, to ruin their credibility, and I think that's particularly the case in the UK. I mean, obviously his error was probably a bit more egregious, but nonetheless, it doesn't take much to notice in leaders. Thinking about what we've looked at, what's been really interesting is if you look at trust as a general concept, in trust in organisations or trust in whether commercial or government or otherwise, it tends to be that politicians and political leaders are not particularly well trusted. That's not the case in Australia, and it's actually quite unusual that the most trusted sources around COVID are certainly the health authorities, national and state. But political leaders have levels of trust that probably they rarely see. And they're very much seen as authorities. We also have seen some differences across states. I won't go into those details here, but nonetheless, you can, if you go on that link I shared, you can have a look at some of those findings. So we do see different leaders being able to be more persuasive within their communities, and so it is an interesting. I do think that political leaders potentially can play a very important role. They certainly, by doing the wrong thing, can really undermine the activities they're doing or the desirable outcomes that they're seeking.
Can I thank both Benjamin and Liam and our audience for all of their questions? This has been a really interesting and very, very topical discussion that we've just had. An edited recording of this webinar will be up on the NRCoP website within 7 days. If you can please take a moment to fill in the evaluation survey, that'd be fantastic. And stay safe, and we look forward to your participation in future webinars. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you in particular, Benjamin and Liam. See you later.